This is a production of Cornell University.
Communities around the world are coming together to rebuild and restore local environments that have been affected by crisis or disaster. In an April 2015 Chats in the Stacks book talk at Mann Library, Marianne Krasny, Professor of Natural Resources and Director of Cornell's Civic Ecology Lab, speaks about her new book, Civic Ecology, Adaptation and Transformation from the Ground Up. The book offers stories about this emerging grassroots environmental stewardship and includes a framework for understanding this growing international phenomenon. The book is co-authored by Keith Tidball, Department of Natural Resources, and used for the MOOC class, Civic Ecology, Reclaiming Broken Places, offered through edX. Their research investigates how people, practices, and communities interact to produce successful outcomes.
And thank you all for coming. When you write a book, there's also lots of other thanks that you have to give, right? To your family, who sort of puts up with you when you're writing a book, to your colleague, especially Keith Tidball, who the book is really sort of a compendium of our collaborative scholarship over about 10 years. And then I also wanted to thank one of the people to whom the book is dedicated, who's here in this room, and that's my mother-in-law, Nancy Whitmore. And the reason I wanted to thank her, besides for being my mother-in-law, is that this book is not really an academic book. It's really, I wanted to write it for the educated lay audience, and my mother-in-law isn't an academic, so I wanted somebody to read it who could tell me what they understand and what they don't understand. And when you're writing a manuscript, it's kind of hard to find people that will, you can actually ask to read something that's kind of extensive, but she volunteered for the job and gave me some feedback, so I really appreciate that. All right, so how many of you here came to find out something about the process of writing a book? Good, because most of you then, I'm assuming, came because you want to know something about the book per se, which is good. I will just, if people are thinking of, I mean, I'm sure many of you have written books, but I just want to say that the book was published by MIT Press, and they were really wonderful to work with. So if anybody is thinking about working with them, I certainly can talk with you offline later on. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is then give you a little background as to my career here and how I came to write this book with Keith Tidball. And then I'm going to give you a few definitions, just two, civic ecology practices and civic ecology. And then I'm going to go into the 10 principles of civic ecology, which is really the way the book is organized, as well as the way that our MOOC, or if you're not familiar with the term MOOC, Massive Open Online Course, is organized. And then at the end, I'm going to just have one or two slides on so what, and then, because I can't resist, because I'm really, really excited about the MOOC, which launches tomorrow at noon. And I should also mention we have the teaching assistant here, Summer Dean, who's just been invaluable in helping to develop the MOOC over the past, since August. I'll just mention that briefly. Okay, so starting with how I got into this. So as Mary mentioned, I came in 1986, and I'm sure many of you have heard that Fontana's Fontana shoe store ad, like we've been here since before you were born. Sometimes I feel like that, especially with all the students and grad students and even their parents now. But anyway, and my position is 70% extension and 30% research. So extension, cooperative extension, is everybody familiar with cooperative extension? And then specifically my position when I started and still is to provide leadership for the 4-H Natural Resources Program. And 4-H is the youth component of extension. So broadly, since I started, I've been working in environmental sciences, broader than natural resources per se, and also working with educators of youth. So teachers, people who work in nature centers, community centers, et cetera. But when I first found out I was going to be interviewed for this job, I had never heard of extension before, or 4-H. I'm from a suburban background, and 4-H at the time was quite rural. And so I was living in Berkeley. I called up Alameda County Cooperative Extension. I said, can you tell me what cooperative extension is? And the receptionist kind of said, well, not really, but she sent me some materials. And I read that the mission of extension is to extend the research of the university to the people of the state. So I figured, okay, I'm moving to New York, and Most of the people in New York live in New York City, live in cities, and so I should concentrate most of my efforts in the city, which wasn't really what was done in Extension at the time because we have these very rural agricultural roots. When I got here, I was working very closely with Nancy Troutman, who's now at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Many of you know her. And we were working in sort of environmental sciences broadly. And at the time, waste management was really a big issue in New York State. And so we were looking at composting education and how we produce some materials, workshops, et cetera, on composting education. So I was thinking, how can we do this in the city? And I'd heard that there was this amazing community garden in the Lower East Side of New York City, of Manhattan, that had an amazing compost system. And that's the Open Road Garden. You can still go there today. It's at, between 11th and 12th and around A and B in the Lower East Side. And when I got there, there was, in fact, this amazing composting system. There was a school on one side of this garden. And the youth would go into this greenhouse, and they collected with a wheelbarrow waste from a nearby juice bar. They'd wheel this wheelbarrow through the streets of Manhattan, back up this path, and then they had this compost system that was heating this greenhouse. Now, this is pretty cool. You can teach science here right in the city, environmental sciences. But on the other side of the garden was a building that was being used as a mosque. And unfortunately, I don't have a photo, but it was before iPhones, so I didn't take a lot of photos. But if you can imagine looking at this greenhouse and then looking around to the back side of the garden, there was a raised bed. And the people that were gardening in this raised bed were Bangladeshi immigrants, so they were from the mosque on the other side of the garden. And they were dressed in their long kurtas, the long shirts that they wear. And it was even more amazing for me, anyway, than the composting system, because what they were doing was they were, in this raised bed, they had what we would call an interplanting or intercropping system. So they were raising pigeon peas, a legume, amaranth, a grain. They were raising flowering coriander to attract beneficial insects. And they were raising marigolds, which they felt would repel the nematodes in the soil. So I said, not only to myself, not only can you teach science in the city, in a community garden in Lower Manhattan, but you can also teach science within the cultural context of the diversity of people who are living in these places. So that led to youth. It was really an intergenerational community gardening education program that we did for many years called Garden Mosaics. And in 2003, I hired Keith Tidball to run that program. And Keith and I, through working on Garden Mosaics together, we were really lucky because we got to travel to lots of community gardens, really all over the world. So for example, when we were in South Africa, we went to the Soweto Mountain of Hope community garden, which is very symbolic in terms of sort of the transition from apartheid to the post-apartheid era. It was a very dangerous site during apartheid, where there were tire burnings and a lot of violence, and then afterwards it's become this amazing community resource, both cultural, a lot of sculpture and artworks, as well as vegetable plots, and also AIDS gardens to memorialize AIDS victims. We visited refugee gardens, Afghan refugee gardens in Toronto. I remember one garden in Minneapolis where there's South Korean elderly gardeners that had moved to the US to be with their families but really didn't speak English, but this was a place where they could get together and meet. So from visiting all these gardens, we started to think to ourselves, well, these gardens are really important in healing. They're part of the resilience process or the recovery process for these people who have suffered incredible hardships. And we actually saw this happening after 9/11 also, where people would just sort of spontaneous plant daffodils in what they call memorial gardens or living memorials in green spaces or along median strips in New York City and other places. So in 2006, Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. And Keith was part of a green team from City and Regional Planning that was asked to go down and help plan with the recovery. And before he left, we said, well, you're probably going to find community gardening kind of as an expression of, we're going to come back, resilience, resistance. But when he got there, and this is Keith in New Orleans after Katrina, he didn't really find community gardens. He did find people saying, we're going to rebuild, we're going to come back. You remember the media at the time was, this is the end, like New Orleans is, it'll never come back. But instead of planting gardens, they were actually doing a lot of tree planting, which maybe isn't so surprising given that trees, live oak trees, are so much a part of the history and the culture and really the sense of place of New Orleans. So then when he came back and he reported this to me and we had a big discussion and we said, well, we're starting to see community gardening, we're starting to see community tree planting, and this is kind of a phenomenon, right, of people who have suffered hardships often and in urban areas. They're coming out and doing these planting and community sort of bonding activities. And so I said to him, because he was working for me at the time, so I could tell him what to do, which was nice. Things have changed. I asked him, can you think of a name for this phenomenon? Can you come up with a term? And he came back, and he came up with the term, obviously, civic ecology. So I said I'd do two definitions. So civic ecology practice is local environmental stewardship actions that are taken to enhance the green infrastructure, so basically to enhance the environment, as well as to enhance community well-being in urban and other human-dominated systems. So just some other practices. There's a community garden. I mentioned those earlier. This is in the Bronx, one of the places where we did garden mosaics. You can see the kids learning from the elderly gentleman. This one's in Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C. They're using a bandalong trap, the kids to collect litter that's floating down Watts Creek, which is a tributary of Anacostia River. So they're sort of cleaning up the river with this trap. And then this one, does anybody recognize where this is? Yeah, the gorge, near your house there, Beth. This is Fall Creek Gorge. It's actually, you can see it's a few years ago because we still had the wooden fences back then. But I then started my own civic ecology practice, also sort of after a disaster that I felt like I needed to do something. It was actually before the suicides, but when there were, I think, 4 drowning deaths one summer. And so this is my civic ecology practice. It's called Friends of the Gorge. We involve students in trail restoration, removing invasive species, tree planting, and litter cleanups. So when Keith came up with the term civic ecology, he chose the word ecology on purpose. And that is because ecology, sort of in the broader sense, is about interactions. So not only civic ecology practices, but we also talk about civic ecology, which is a field of interdisciplinary study that's concerned with individual, community, and environmental outcomes of community-based environmental stewardship practices, and the interactions of such practices with the people and other organisms, the communities, the governance institutions, and I'll explain what that is later, and the ecosystems in which they take place. So, and this definition is really the basis of those principles that I'm going to discuss shortly. But I just wanted to say that one of the great things about doing outreach and research focused on civic ecology is that whenever I go someplace, I can almost find a practice that I can visit or sometimes even participate in. And you can't find them by searching civic ecology because that's not a commonly used word, but you can usually find something. So this one, I went to Miami last year and I found the Urban Paradise Guild, and they were doing some invasive species removal in a state park in Miami. And so I was able to go out with them and figure out what people were doing in Miami, which was really fun. And I was visiting University of Miami. And then usually when I do this, graduate students or sometimes even faculty want to come along too and see what's going on. And then this one, does people know where that one is at the top?
City Cemetery.
Yeah, Ithaca City Cemetery. Is anybody familiar with the Friends of the Ithaca City Cemetery? Well, we have what I would call a civic ecology group right here in Ithaca. In addition to we have a number of community gardens. And Ellen Leventree, so some of you know because she's in Cal's communication. She's one of the leaders. And Summer Dean and Summer's actually created a story of this practice with all kinds of videos and photos that she took, I should say, including her children, the one in the blue dress back there. But when we went out with them, we not only picked up litter and we pruned trees, but you can see we were also restoring gravestones. So each practice is unique like this, and it's really interesting to see all the variation. Okay, so as part of the MOOC, or the Massive Open Online Course, I've worked with a fantastic team from the Center for Teaching Excellence and from Academic Technologies. and one of the team members is Mike Tolomeo. And he created this graphic that we use in the course. And each one of these planets or spheres refers to one of the 10 principles of civic ecology. And we've organized them essentially in 4 groups, sort of by topic. So the first is where and why. So that's kind of where and why do civic ecology practices emerge. The second is the parts, so all the sort of elements of civic ecology practices. The third orbit is systems, so it's how the practices, kind of zooming out, how the practice interact with governance and also social ecological systems. And then the last one is about policy or expanding the practices. Okay, so I'm going to talk about where and why first. And I'll go through the 10 principles in these 4 categories. So the first one is that civic ecology practices emerge in broken places. Now, Keith and I talk about 2 different kinds of broken places. One is a place like this. I actually think this is Atlantic City, although everybody thinks it's Detroit. But you've all seen about Detroit in the news and about the abandonment of the houses. And I really like this photo because you can see sort of succession here. So the plants are bigger here. This lot maybe was abandoned before this lot. You can see the vegetation overgrowing the sidewalk. So these are places where there's disinvestment by industry or by business. And then that leads to poverty, crime. Often there's some contamination from industry. The green spaces also become degraded. And then people are leaving the city, like you see here, and then there's further disinvestment. So we call these slow burn broken places, places that are formed gradually. We also have what we call sudden broken places, or sudden red zones, as Keith would call them. So does anyone recognize where this is? Seaside Heights? Is that because you're from New Jersey? So you're right, this is after Hurricane Sandy, but I think this is Far Rockaway. That makes sense, the boardwalk on Far Rockaway, right? Yeah. So a hurricane where there was a sudden disturbance. I think you can sort of understand the difference between the sort of slow burn and the sudden. But both of these are broken places. And so the next principle is that because of their love for life, and there's a term for that, biophilia, and love for the places, and there's another term for that, topophilia, or love of place. So because of biophilia and topophilia, or love for places they have lost, civic ecology stewards defy, reclaim, and recreate these broken places. So in Detroit, we read about the urban agriculture and community gardening, but there's also tree planting. Far Rockaway, people came out after the hurricane. These are just small-scale civic ecology practices to restore the sand dunes and hopefully have better shoreline protection in the future. And then just to sort of show that this phenomenon just is not only in the US, but more or less universal. This is after Typhoon Rusa in South Korea. And you can see that there's actually buildings on here before the typhoon. People are coming out, planting the conifer trees and trying to rebuild what are traditional village groves that would have protected the shoreline and these small villages from erosion and wind. Okay, so we've done where and why. Now we're going to go to the parts. And I like to use the term bricolage, the idea that handymen take all kinds of different parts and pieces and they put them together and something creative emerges. So we have 5 different pieces or parts that piece together in different ways become civic ecology practices. So the first one, in recreating place, civic ecology practices recreate community. So this practice, can anybody guess where it is? It's a place that's been in the news a lot the last week. A whole lot. Come on, guys. Yemen, no, but close. Iran, this is Iran. And this is a practice called nature cleaners. And people in nature cleaners, they go out to very public spaces and they collect litter. It's a practice that started in one city, but it's really taking off. Apparently it's in all, I think, about 35, 40 provinces now in Iran. And a lot of times these things take off through Facebook. So, but getting back to the theme, community, after people go out and collect litter, they often come together for tea or maybe a meal, soup. And so, when you talk to people that are engaged in civic ecology practice, a lot of it is about social connections, right? Creating ties, coming together around nature to create a sense of community. Okay, so the second part. Civic ecology stewards draw on social ecological memories to recreate places and communities. So social ecological memories. Ecological memories or biological memories would be the genetic material, like seeds, seeds or other propagules. And then, or it could be animals, like remnant populations of bald eagles, for example, that would be used to restore bald eagle populations. The social part is about cultivation practices. So you put them together and you have social ecological memories. This is one of my favorite photos. It's a Lao American gardener in Sacramento. So it's a refugee who came to California. And people who have studied these refugees coming from Southeast Asia, they've documented that people would actually sow seeds in the hems of their jackets when they came. And so however she got these seeds here, she's growing foot-long or yard-long beans in Sacramento in a garden. And then this one is in New York, but from looking at this, can anybody tell where the gardeners might be from? So the feature that's the hint is this little casita, little house. So this is a Hispanic, or I think it's a Puerto Rican garden. So people will recreate sort of structures that are from where they've immigrated from or migrated from. So in this case, they would have had a casita when they worked in the fields where they could go and rest, maybe in the afternoon, to get out of the hot sun. This garden is in Philadelphia. And what I really love here is that there's this mural here of a rural scene. And this is a largely African-American garden. So again, many African-Americans, they migrated from the South to the industrial cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, and they're often engaged in community gardening. And they're growing things like cotton and okra in New York City. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Oh, so here's a very different example of social ecological memories, one that I really like. So how many of you have read Mark Kurlansky's book, History on a Half Shell, The Big Oyster? It's a really good book, especially if you're interested in New York City and its history. So he talks about, just how important oysters were in the history of New York City. They were once so abundant that New York was called the Big Oyster. And if you were going to New York, people would say, well, enjoy the oysters and tell me about it when you get back. And so there's a civic ecology practice that we call oyster gardening, which I'll explain in a minute. But we interviewed the oyster gardeners in New York City, and we asked them, sort of, what's motivating you to get involved? And they talked about the oysters in a lot of different ways. But one was the oyster, they called it the liver of the estuary. So they're not eating these oysters, right, because the water is contaminated. But they felt that the oyster was going to filter out the contaminants from the water. And one day, maybe their children or their grandchildren would be able to eat the oysters. I don't know if it's really biologically accurate, but I think it's really interesting how they think about the oyster as helping to bring back the New York City estuary. But they didn't just talk about helping to bring back the ecology or the biology of the estuary. They also talked about how oysters were like the hot dog, the earlier hot dog of New York City, because you would go to these street stands like this and you would buy oysters instead of buying hot dogs. So I think that it's really telling that these people are integrating, as now scientists talk about it in departments like mine, the ecological processes and the social processes. So this is just oyster gardening. What it is that volunteer groups, sometimes they're like yacht clubs that have access to some, like Staten Island, a point in the estuary, where they have access to the water. And this is a group of young people in the Bronx. So they're in the Bronx River, and they have these artificial oyster reefs. They're collaborating with scientists. They're lowering these reefs down that have the young oysters in them, and then they're drawing them up to measure their growth and their survival. Okay, so moving on. Civic ecology practices produce ecosystem services. So if you have a community gardening, it produces food. That's an ecosystem service. That's pretty easy for people to think about. But this is again in the Bronx. This is a youth group rocking the boat. And that's the Bronx River. So they're creating this artificial wetland here. So the importance of the artificial wetland is, as you know, in cities there's so much pavement and so much impermeable surface in buildings and roofs that there's a lot of runoff. So these kinds of artificial wetlands can absorb that runoff so it doesn't rush into the water, absorbs some of the contaminants in the runoff, and also prevents some from erosion. And we have a director, and I think a past director from Plantations, and you guys have built something similar, right, Don? By the parking lot there. Very impressive. I love. In fact, we used a picture of that in our MOOC. So here's just the finished wetland here along the Bronx River that these young people made. Okay. So this one's about health and well-being. And I really love this photo. Can anybody identify where it's from? Brooklyn. Yay, the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So how many of you have been to the relatively recent Brooklyn Bridge Park? Well, it's really a fun place to visit. It's obviously a lot of infrastructure and money went into it. But there is a friends group, Friends of the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and they are helping with the landscaping on this particular day. And what I really love is that there's such an intergenerational feel to this practice and in this photo. So in the book, we created these two trees to distinguish between the health outcomes of, well, I'll talk about the second part first, but the first part is the health outcomes of what we're calling seeing green. So seeing green is looking out the window and seeing this beautiful forest, or taking a walk around BB Lake, being in nature, basically. And there's tons and tons of research on the health outcomes of being in nature or seeing green, and Nancy Wells here at Cornell in Design and Environmental Analysis is one of the sort of world experts on this, very well renowned. So just some of the potential outcomes: happiness and recovery from grief, reduced mental fatigue, reduced attention deficit disorder symptoms, positive social interactions, quicker healing times, and there's been a lot done on reduced stress also. But civic ecology practices are not just about being in nature, they're about stewarding or caring for nature. So we created another tree that's about doing green. And so we posit anyway that you would have the same cognitive, social, and therapeutic benefits that you have of seeing green, but in addition there's things like legacy, leaving a legacy. So for example, some research done on the land care groups in Australia, the volunteers, older volunteers talk about they can leave a legacy not only for the environment, but for their grandchildren through getting engaged in these restoration and stewardship practices. Self-efficacy, feeling as if you're doing something and being effective. And then there's a great article about empowerment and community gardening among poor African women in a Cape Town township. So these are just some of the health or well-being outcomes. And then the last one, I think in this part, is about learning. And I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of African American gardeners in these community gardens in New York and Philadelphia and other places. So this is Willie Morgan. His garden is in Harlem, and he's growing cotton here. So I visited Willie Morgan quite a while ago. He's from South Carolina, and I asked him, why are you growing cotton? So what he told me is that he's growing cotton because he really wants the young people in the city to understand something about their cultural heritage and really the challenges that their ancestors faced through sharecropping and then further back through slavery. So that's why he's growing cotton and other plants that are from, really usually grown in South Carolina where he's from. Okay, so we're moving right along. Now we're going to go to this third orbit, and we're going to talk about how these practices, the whole practice, not thinking so much about the individual parts or components anymore, interact with governance and then social ecological systems. So governance is basically the idea that not just formal government, like city or state or federal, is important in making policies and in managing land, but also the nonprofit sector and the community-based organizations, as well as other organizations like the private sector. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Chicago Wilderness. It's a great book about the Chicago Wilderness called Miracle Under the Oaks, which is about how it started. A restoration project, just small groups of people, both volunteers and scientists. They decided they wanted to bring back the sort of savanna landscapes that at one time were in the Chicago region. So they're grassland with, sort of open grassland with oaks and other trees. So the Chicago Wilderness, since when it started, I think in the 1970s, has grown. It's not just in Chicago, it's all over the Chicago region, the southern Lake Michigan region. But also the idea that these practices start as small local innovations and expand to encompass multiple partnerships, I tried to capture in this graphic. So, for example, you have a small civic ecology group like Friends of the Forest Preserve. You might have a lot of these groups scattered throughout the Chicago region. And then you have larger groups like the Field Museum that have a bit of higher capacity, and they're sending out, you know, they might do after-school programs, and their kids go out and help with the restoration activities. And then you have the city of Chicago that's involved, and that's kind of the Chicago Wilderness. So now there's, about 360 organizations in the Chicago Wilderness, and there are all these kinds of government, nonprofit, community-based groups, as well as some private industry like Davey Tree Company that are part of this network of groups all involved in restoration and stewardship of Chicago's open areas. But you can go up, and then there's state parks, and then you can imagine sort of at the national level, Land Trust Alliance, that would be sort of networks of these groups at the lower levels. And then finally, there's this thing called the Metropolitan Green Space Alliance, which is actually an alliance of land trusts. And I think there's 5 city sort of groups like Chicago Wilderness or networks that are actually then networked from the Metropolitan Green Space Alliance. And I wanted to share one other example of this because I think this example is really important because this is how these practices are expanding these days. And I thank Summer for introducing me to this practice called the Ugly Indian. And you can search the Ugly Indian. I encourage you to go on their website. They have a really very interesting website. So how many have been to India? Have had the opportunity to go to India? And how many in India have seen something like, who've been to India have seen something like that? It's kind of shocking, right? There's just piles of trash along the sidewalk, public urination. I've even seen defecation along spaces like this. It's kind of awful. And so the Ugly Indian, it's a nonprofit group, they said, it's more like a loose alliance rather than a group. What they've said is that we're all ugly Indians. This is all of our responsibility. We're all contributing to this, and we're going to do something about it. And it started in Bangalore. So I think sort of demographically what happened is that you have sort of a emerging middle class, these guys that are educated, high tech, and they said, we just don't want to live like this anymore. So what they do is they conduct what are called spot fixes. It's all sort of facilitated, organized through Facebook. So they come out at a certain time, and we're all going to work together, and then they convert spaces like this to spaces like this. It's pretty incredible. And they try to act like they're very low tech and low input and just totally citizen-based, but they have some very savvy designers sort of in that you don't even know their names because they try to be totally anonymous. But for example, the red color is on purpose because anybody's seen people chew betel nut before and spit, the red spit. It's kind of gross. The first time I saw it, I thought it was blood. And so the whole idea is you paint this color, and then all those stains from people spitting the betel nut juice will not be visible anymore. And the other really interesting thing about this color is that it's a neutral color for all the religious groups and ethnic groups in India. So as I say, they got some good design savvy, and they're very savvy about Facebook also. So this practice that started in Bangalore now, it is just like spread all over India. They got thousands of people involved. It spread to Pakistan, where Summer's from, which is how I found out about it, because she heard about what from a cousin? Or
It was a news article.
news?
I read about it. I spoke to people.
Yeah. So there was a news article in a newspaper in Pakistan. And I actually was able to bring over a guy from the Ugly Indian for a workshop that I did recently. So I'm very excited about this practice because I think it's just interesting how these people use. I'll mention one other thing. Okay, so if you do one of these spot fixes, you're supposed to take a before and after picture, and you fill out a little form, and then immediately it's uploaded to Facebook. So you get recognition immediately that you've done this and you've made this change. And he talks about see the change you want to be, which is a riff on one of Gandhi's slogan. Okay, so we're going to go to the next one. Civic ecology practices are embedded in cycles of chaos and renewal, which in turn are nested in social ecological systems. So we're not talking about ecosystems per se, because when we're working in cities and really just about anywhere, there's interactions between the social component and the ecological component. So that's why we use that kind of awkward word, social ecological systems. And this is called the adaptive cycle, and it's basically an image that helps you to understand how social ecological systems change over time. So I'm just going to apply it to civic ecology practices. So you can imagine a city like New York in what we call the conservation phase. So the late 1990s, let's think about that, when before 9/11, economy was doing well, things were fairly stable. But you still have small-scale disturbances, right? So you might have heavy rains. And you can imagine that a civic ecology practice like that, artificial wetland, would play a role in helping the system to adapt to these small-scale changes. So this is about adaptation to small-scale changes, and that's why there's the subtitle, Adaptation and then Transformation from the Ground Up in our book. But eventually, any kind of system like this that's sort of more or less steady state is going to experience some disturbance, massive like 9/11 or in New Orleans, the flooding here. And what happens is essentially the system, it might be brinking on what they call a tipping point or a threshold. So some people, as you remember, after Hurricane Katrina, they were saying, oh, New Orleans has reached a tipping point, it's never going to come back. And even after 9/11, people were wondering if the economy of New York City would ever come back. So essentially, you enter a release phase or a chaos phase where processes break down. And then we make the case that in this reorganization or transformation phase, that these practices can play a role also. Small-scale role, right? I mean, there's lots of things that have brought New Orleans back. It's now one of the most attractive cities for young people to go that want to sort of rebuild the city. But we think these sort of greening community practices have a role. And certainly after 9/11, this is a slide of the 9/11 living memorials. So as I mentioned before, people were spontaneously coming out and planting to memorialize, and it helps with the recovery practice. Okay, so we're going to go to the last one. And this one is about policymakers having a role to play in growing civic ecology practices. And by policymakers, I'm talking not just about government officials, but also about the nonprofit sector. Okay, so here's the Bronx River. People are sort of monitoring the health of the Bronx River. And here we have a slide of only 6 organizations that are involved in the Bronx River restoration, which actually began with just a couple of organizations in the late 70s. And the great thing that happened here that I think was very savvy on the part of New York City government is that when they saw all this great sort of civic engagement and restoration happening along the Bronx River and within the watershed, they decided that they weren't going to sort of assume control of this. And the reason that's important is because a lot of times as the city government decides that, say, they're going to run all the community gardens, for example, sometimes that grassroots spirit, that sort of initiative, can be quashed. So instead, they've supported the Bronx River Alliance as sort of the central organization for what's going on with all these Bronx River restoration activities, and there's now 60 organizations that are involved. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just switch quickly, because it's still on this idea of policy, and in this case, I'm going to be talking or showing you a short video, if I can figure it out, because I'm the least tech-savvy person in the world. probably why I'm so impressed by Facebook. And this is a video, okay.
Bronx, around those parklands.
It's the Bronx River Restoration.
This gave me like an 8-mile backyard.
So you see the citizens who are engaged. And then we're going to have a congressman who's engaged, who's very engaged and has been supporting this effort over years.
And I am the creator for the Bronx River Alliance.
I always felt that it was wrong to assume that the inner city could not enjoy the people in the suburbs of the country. We had a river here, so why not clean it up and make it usable for the people of the community? I'm Congressman Jose E. Serrano, and I represent the South Bronx. I grew up in the Bronx. I knew there was a river here, but I knew that it was a taboo to come anywhere near the river. That's what we were told. It was dirty, it wasn't safe, it was unkept, it was not in any way usable, if you will, for the community. When I went to Congress, we began to get more and more involved, my office did, in reviving the Bronx River. And the Bronx River became this mission throughout the years. We brought in $30 million for what is known as the Bronx River cleanup. It also expanded to other surrounding programs that affected the river.
And we do a lot of ecology restoration projects. We use the Bronx River as an outdoor classroom.
So what I want to do is just show you another little clip later on in this video of Serrano, because the theme here is about how policymakers, like a congressman, can support these practices. And he talked about, he leveraged, well, a lot of what we'd call today earmark funds for the Bronx River Restoration Project, went to Bronx River Alliance and other organizations. And then I like the ending. Oops, it's not quite working. So, I think it's about here.
River, the part that I played, stands right up there. The river is not just a river, it's a symbol of life. The river is a symbol of a community not giving up. The Bronx River now has become a symbol of how you turn urban life into something beautiful that can be used by all of the people. It created a movement. Started out just as cleaning up the river, but created a movement.
Okay, so I like what he says there about, let me just get back onto, from current slide. We created a movement. We started out just cleaning up the river, but we created a movement. And I think this is one perspective on the larger implications of civic ecology practices. Is this becoming a movement, per se, or part of a movement? There's a lot been written about the civic environmental movement. And in the book, I have a very short section on aftermath, because I kind of wrote the whole book, and then I thought, well, I really need to think about what's going on now, and is there any application to sort of climate change and some of the bigger challenges we're facing now? So this is one way to think about it. But I also just wanted to mention that with support from the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, I actually convened a workshop in February, and I paired civic ecology practitioners with academics, and together with, from all these different disciplines that the academics are bringing with them, and the different practices, we have about 12 pairs, I think, 10 or 12 pairs. We're writing a book on, to investigate this question of sort of what are the larger impacts or potential outcomes of these very small scale practices. And then I also wanted to mention that I now, thanks to Cornell supporting me for a very wonderful Public Voices Fellowship, I blog for the Huffington Post, and so I actually did a little piece here on some of the perspectives of Lance Gunderson and some of the other academics that were there. A first take at answering this question of what are some of the larger impacts. I'm not going to go in that because I'm really running out of time, but I did want to mention our MOOC, because as I said, I'm very, very excited about the MOOC. We launch tomorrow at 12 noon. I look every few hours on how many people we have signed up. So we had about 3,810 a couple hours ago, 3,810. And what's really cool is that we have a very active Facebook site. I called up my daughter this morning because we were at 499 on the Facebook site, and I said, sign up for the Facebook because I need to get over 500, but by the time she signed up, we had like 503. So, but what's really cool is that people are sort of saying, hey, I'm from Alberta, Canada. We actually have somebody from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have, actually I should have mentioned, 145 countries signed up, which is very typical for MOOCs, actually. I think less than half are from the US. So, and they're starting to form these groups, and they started their own Facebook group this morning. So we're from Alberta, Canada. Is anybody else from Alberta, Canada? Let's have our own Facebook group. So there's a lot of interaction already, which I actually find really fun. You talk about you sit in front of the computer, you don't relate to people, but I always feel like I'm relating to people when I'm involved in these activities. And then there's also a term, so as if MOOC wasn't bad enough, Massive Open Online Course, there's a term GROUP, which is Group Open Online Course. And so, you know, what they're doing in Alberta is kind of like a group because they're taking it together, they'll be discussing it together, but also groups can be like reading clubs where you meet once a week to discuss the material. And one of the things that we're doing is I've actually hired about 6 mentors because one of the problems with MOOCs is they haven't lived up to their potential, right? It was going to democratize education. Anybody, no matter where they lived, how much money they had, was going to be able to access education through these online courses. But I think there's some accessibility issues, even in the US. A lot of people don't have computers. And then there's also you need, I think, a minimum level of education to be able to access the content. So I've hired Akima Price, who actually met with her group for the first time yesterday in Washington, D.C. in Anacostia. And she's gotten together a group of adults who she's going to mentor them in taking the course. And I can't remember if I just mentioned, but she's the other person the book is dedicated to because she does so much of this community engagement work. And then we have a little research project that's going on to try to help us understand what are some of the barriers for these low-income groups and people of color to accessing these online resources and courses. And then another person that we've hired is Xavier Brown, who also works in DC, and he just posted on Facebook, vacant lot in Woodland Terrace, DC. Community members want to turn it into a park dedicated to peace. And we do see a lot of peace parks, too, on these vacant lots. So we're doing a service learning project in the MOOC. They're supposed to either get engaged with or visit and then report on a civic ecology practice. So I'm really rooting for Xavier that maybe he'll turn this into a peace park with his group that he's working with in DC. Okay, so I just want to thank all of you for your attention. It's getting kind of late, so I appreciate you staying here and open it to questions.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.